Hello, everybody, and welcome to the My BFF Business Leaders podcast. This podcast is designed to focus the spotlight on leading voices throughout the world of business. From marketing and technology to energy and finance, this podcast will feature brilliant minds that are shaping the future of every industry. There has never been a better time to make more business friends forever, so let's get started.
I, as a person of color in America, have parts of my experience that are significantly different than a white or Caucasian person in America has. And it's probably very ethereal to most Americans who are not Black that there's this strained, not just adversarial, but disconnected relationship between law enforcement and people of color for literally fear of their lives.
On this episode of the My BFF Business Leaders podcast, we are joined by the COO of Keller Williams Capital Properties, Dontae Carroll. Dontae started out his career with RE/MAX and has worked in leadership roles with such well-known real estate brands as Century 21 and Long & Foster. In his current role, he oversees the operations of 8 offices and over 1,000 sales professionals throughout the Baltimore-Washington metropolitan area. Dontae is a true leader that never stops adding to his own personal value proposition. Whether it's coaching, strategic planning, or business development, he continues to drive deep, long-term organizational value that adds to the bottom line. A longtime friend and colleague of MyBFFSocial founder, Matt Gentile, our special guest host for this episode.
Welcome, Dontae. Super excited to have you here today. You and I have known each other for, maybe over 10 years now, since our days at Realogy. What have you been up to? Tell our listeners a little bit about, what your current role is. I've kind of studied a little bit on LinkedIn to get an update on where you've been, but please tell us for yourself.
Well, Matt, thank you for the opportunity to reconnect. Certainly consider you one of my good friends that I've met along the way in this business, and I'm appreciative of a chance for us to have this conversation. You're right. It's been roughly a dozen or so years, I think, since we first met, and lots has changed, I think, in that time. Last I left you in the Realogy world, I was the VP of the Mid-Atlantic for Ops and Service. Went on to Long & Foster for 7 years after, becoming the regional manager and senior vice president for the Long & Foster Northern Virginia region, which at that time and to this day is the largest, most profitable piece of the Long & Foster footprint. So ostensibly running that portion of the business, which equated to, back in 2018, what would have been the 9th largest real estate company in the country if it were a standalone. I decided to shun that opportunity and have nothing but good things to say about the experience I had at L&F. However, the experience I would not have gotten there was the opportunity to become an equity partner in a firm that I was helping to build, unless I was willing to cough up money to Mr. Buffett at the tune of $285,000 a share, I believe is what Berkshire Hathaway trades at, somewhere in that neighborhood. So came to KW Capital Properties, which is DC-based firm, 8 locations, roughly 1,000 agents, $2.4 billion in sales volume, roughly 5,500 or so transactions at the end of 2019. Get an opportunity to work with Bowman Keaty, who has started with 5 agents 13 years ago and built out a pretty sizable independent, branded franchise with KW. And I am now his business partner and managing partner for the real estate operations and the ancillary services that we are building or have built around the business. So that sort of catches you up to where we are today. And certainly looking forward to having some robust dialogue with you.
Yeah. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished since, leaving the Century 21 and Realogy brands. Now that you're with KW, when I was there, KW was climbing. Century 21 at that point was the largest real estate franchisor in the world, and I think they've been surpassed now, unless I'm mistaken. And I don't track this every day like I used to, but it's my understanding that KW has surpassed that brand and continues to grow.
That is correct. As of I want to say at the end of 2018, KW was the largest real estate brand in the world. About 160 plus thousand agents right now throughout the world, and we do more transactions than any other real estate brand in the business right now.
What makes KW such an attractive value proposition for professionals, like yourself and agents?
Well, I think there are a variety of answers. The one that I'd like to speak to, though, most is the nonlinear real estate space that exists in the KW world. And by that, I mean, whether it's pick a brand, C21, Coldwell Banker, there's agent, maybe have a team, maybe you become a branch manager, you could maybe become a franchisee, what have you. In the world of KW, it's certainly obviously a real estate organization, but much more than that, in that you can be an agent, you can be a coach, you can be a trainer, you can be an investor in a market center or what we would equate to a branch office and other brands. You can be an operating principal, which means that's a broker owner. You could have equity in a team, or you could build a mega team. So there are so many paths on the opportunity map for the KW experience that it creates much more than a very linear kind of laid out. There's 2-3 things that you can do in the space of being in that real estate model. In our model, you can do this and this and this and this and this, and those things, certainly as long as they're legal, ethical, and moral. There's no conflict of interest with regard to what your opportunity path might look like.
Got it. So a lot more flexibility as it relates to, opportunity. It's interesting.
Absolutely.
I always enjoy hearing the various value propositions from, the real estate brokerage community. Now, given all that's happened over the past 3 months, with COVID-19 and all that is transpiring across our nation, how is the real estate market kind of taking it from the macro level and boiling it down to more of the micro market level for you and the Baltimore-Washington area? How is the market responding, and how is it specifically in your market?
So obviously, the old the axiom in real estate is real estate is local, right? And if you think about the DMV, the District, Maryland, Virginia market, by and large, there's no such thing as a recession-proof market. I would argue, though, that the DMV this time certainly, and even last time, 10, 11 years ago when we had the Great Recession, is more recession resistant than most markets. So while we saw a change in market conditions relative to what the trajectory had been as a result of COVID, we are starting to see signs of that rebound happening, probably a lot faster in our marketplace than maybe some others. But interestingly enough, outside of the Beltway, those markets in the more moderate to lower price points, relatively speaking, in DC, which is $300,000 or so, they remain pretty consistent even through COVID. And what we're seeing now, I think, across the industry, whether it's our brand or I think real estate in general, is so COVID has become a forcing mechanism for the modernization of the industry in terms of some of the best practices that will move forward that were somewhat ethereal as it relates to operating in digital space, electronic transacting on the mortgage and title side, much more than just the real estate side. COVID's become a forcing mechanism to bring the business up to speed, really, with where the rest of the world is in many spaces. So how I see the impact of this on what we do most on a micro level in our world is that now this is an opportunity for us to design, to be the architect of what a forward-facing post-COVID digital enhanced still physical experience of being an agent or a consumer looks like in the space of real estate. And that's a pretty exciting place to be. It's scary because in some ways, because nobody's really figured it out. At the same time, it creates a tremendous opportunity that you become the architect of what that looks like, as opposed to having somebody tell you and have what that experience is thrust upon you, if that makes sense.
It does. And it's interesting to hear you kind of cover off on, what KW has done to not only survive in the COVID-19 era that we're living through, but thrive and plan for what its next steps are and start to implement those steps right now. So it's a very interesting take and interesting to learn more of how they're approaching it. So now that we've kind of gone through a little bit of the business questions and got them out of the way, I'd like to ask you on a more personal level, as a person of color, what are your thoughts on George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement? What can be done to help prevent these kinds of killings and issue more meaningful reform as we move forward?
God, that's another podcast in and of itself. I will chunk it out as best I can, and certainly I am offering perspective and my experience. George Floyd's murder, because that's what it was, I think it happened at a time when the world had no other choice but to pay attention because of COVID-19. And in that, what it was illustrative of is the duality of the American experience that people of color versus the majority population in America deals with. And by that, I mean, these two things can be totally true at the same time. I, as a person of color in America, have parts of my experience that are significantly different than a white or Caucasian person in America has. And it's probably very ethereal to most Americans who are not Black that there's this strained, not just adversarial, but disconnected relationship between law enforcement and people of color for literally fear of their lives. Matt, I think you know me pretty well. I'm a family man, professional. My only vice, as you might see it, might be that I support the Ravens. But by and large, you could swap me out with people that we know: Jim Ramsey, Patrick Sullivan, Brian Schaefer, in terms of the family construct and who I am as a person. What this George Floyd thing has done in many ways is awaken America to the two Americas that exist. And again, that duality of the experience is enlightening for a lot of people who didn't realize there was this whole world out there in America that people of color experience that's different than what their experiences have been. And that doesn't in any way lessen an experience that you have because it wasn't inclusive of my experience as a Black man in America. You have to, though, acknowledge, if we're going to have a fair and just society, that does exist. So, what I take away, and I think what the opportunity for us in this time is to awaken to the fact that we have social, political, legal constructs that have not been equal, that have not been just, and that over a period of centuries, not just years, over a period of centuries have created dual constructs in America. And even go back to the founding fathers in terms of the 3/5 count of a Black person, as opposed to a whole, like a man was 3/5 of a man if you were Black, as opposed to a whole man, if you will. And so it started at the beginning of this country. And listen, let me be clear about this. America could be the greatest country on the planet, and it is. And at the same time, have a racist history and construct and systems that need to be addressed to make it even greater. Those things are not diametrically opposed, so they can both exist at the same time. And so the consciousness of America, I think, in many ways has been drawn to and awakened in a way that this time is uniquely positioned for, with the advent of social media and the ability of people to communicate and transmit good, bad, or indifferent messaging and show the world as they see it to an entire world. And so when you think about what you're seeing in this George Floyd thing, it's not by accident that you see like protests and riots in Australia and Germany and England and France and all parts of the world, because injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. If you believe in the idea of men and women being created equal, and none of us are really different. And in terms of if you're O positive and I'm O positive, it doesn't matter that we have different skin complexions. We're like the same insides. It's so crazy when you think about that this construct of inherent bias and racism exists to the degree that it does. When I look at it like interchangeable parts, right? It's like a car. Like if you're a Camry and I'm a Camry, your engine will work in my body, my chassis will work on my chassis and my frame, and the same thing with you, right? So like if you logically deconstruct this idea of like race and inequality, it absolutely makes no sense. And when you go way arc back to the original question, and when you think about the lack of humanity shown to your fellow citizen, with a guy putting his knee on the neck of another man and literally squeezing the life out of him. You can't sit, you no longer have the luxury of sitting back. You no longer have the privilege of not like addressing this issue. And you have to address the issue in a way that says, listen, like Matt, Dontae, you guys weren't around in 1619 or 1865. And it's not a conversation about fault. So I think if there's a person who would listen to this podcast who is white, it's not a conversation about fault. It's a conversation about responsibility. If you know this is happening and you believe in what America stands for, then you have a responsibility to do your part to ensure that this is a fair and just society for all. And if you think about the concept of Black Lives Matter, to just address that second part of your original question, I would encourage people not to hear, when they hear Black Lives Matter, that they matter more. You should probably add a comma in the word TOO to that statement. And it's kind of like when you hear like save the whales, nobody's saying the other fish don't matter, but the whales are in danger. So save the whales, right? And if you think about that conceptually, that's the movement. That's saying, hey, like our lives matter too. And it doesn't matter that you're Dontae, who's like, has been an executive and leader and a business owner and partner in real estate for 20 plus years and straight arrow, if you will. I've got the same hairs that stand up on my back when I see police cars at night. And my 23-year-old son has that same experience, never having been in trouble with the law before a day in his life, college graduate, blah, blah, blah. But there is something wrong if that in our society, if that is a constant, no matter what your socioeconomic background may be, and the only constant in that is that you are a person of color.
That's really strong. And thank you for sharing your thoughts and opinions on that. I'd say, the only thing I would add is, as someone who grew up in the 80s and 90s, as an American, I always felt like a lot of these issues had already been settled in the 60s, in 70s. So, the things that we're seeing and experiencing and hearing and watching, to me are disappointing and upsetting and a little bit disconcerting. I just felt like as a nation, we had made a lot more progress than we're demonstrating. So I just want to pause and thank you for sharing, your thoughts and experience, with our listeners.
I want to maybe dot that with one slight pushback, right? So imagine this. So Matt and Dontae are on the racetrack, right? And we're in starting formation for the race. And the pistol goes off to start the race. And Dontae takes off, and Matt's held in his holding position, in his ready position, right? And let's add some dates to that, right? Let's make it 1619. So Dontae gets to run beginning in 1619, and then Matt gets released from the gate in let's be liberal. Let's say 1865. When is Matt going to catch Dontae? I got a 250-year head start.
Right.
How fast would you have to run to catch up with me?
No, it's an incredible point, and I think it crystallizes for a lot of people what this moment is all about.
Right. And so it's a Herculean task in terms of trying to just unravel it. It's a complex construct, right? And you could, again, I said that's another podcast. You could spend hours on that, and I certainly want to make this I don't want to make this the crux of what we talk about. I think there's a lot that we can cover in this, but I certainly appreciate the fact that you've given some level of importance to a very topical and clearly a pretty important issue that we're dealing with today.
Yeah, thank you. So on that same vein, what has KW and their leadership done to respond to the moment?
Well, I think it was very interesting. Again, I'm not sure if I said this in the beginning, but this is my 20th year in real estate, and this is my 4th real estate organization. So I've been in the room with Dave Liniger, who founded RE/MAX. I've been in a room with, at the time that you and I shared, Alex Perello and Richard Smith, in rooms with those individuals, right? As part of a leadership team, as part of that company. I've been in a room with Wes Foster, the founder of Long & Foster, right? This is the first time I've heard the leader at the top of the house of any real estate organization admit that there's a problem with racial disparity in this country, let alone say that there's a problem in real estate. So I think Gary Keller, to that end, recognizing the moment, I took an awful chance, right? He rolled the dice. And here's why I think it was an incredible roll of the dice. The issue wasn't going to be how the outside world outside of KW responded to it. The issue was, in your own house, there are some people who are going to vehemently disagree with you taking this position. Yet, this isn't a political issue. This is a moral issue. And I think in the moment, he stood on his morality, he stood on his humanity, and he said, I, as the leader of this organization, can't idly stand by and allow injustice to occur and not speak up. And I thought, for me, that doesn't solve the problem. It's not a magic elixir by any stretch of the imagination. Yet it opens the door. So now we've got social equity ambassadors, and there's going to be policy change as a result of folks having conversations about things that, like I said before, in 20 years in this business, I didn't hear people even acknowledge. And I've been, in full candor, I've been in these rooms where I've been the only one who looks like me, or one of the few who looks like me. And what I thought from the perspective of a person who lives this every day, who this is not my existence, not just my experience. I don't think anybody's ever asked me from a leadership perspective. I don't think I can't speak for what's in somebody's heart to say they didn't care. But if their outward action is an indication of caring or not, the fact that they've never asked the question is an indication maybe that it wasn't important enough, or they don't care enough to even have considered what it must be like for those folks in the room. Well, not in the room, because I'm usually been the only one there, but in the ecosystem of real estate, or in the broader ecosystem of America, what your experience as an American of color must be. So I applaud Gary. That's a long way of saying I applaud him for going out and beginning the courageous conversation rooted in morality and the stand that it's very hard to what does it say about you if you have an issue with saying I want a fair and just society for all? What kind of person must you be if that's something that you can't subscribe to? So that's my 2 cents on that. Again, I haven't had a direct conversation with Gary Keller about it. I can only go by what he's shared with the KW family by way of his letter and his words on some leadership Zooms that we've had. And they have been consistent around the idea that I, meaning he in this case, can't stand by and allow injustice and disparity to happen without addressing it as best he can from the stripe on the ball on which he sits. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your perspective on all this. Having someone of your caliber weigh in on this subject, it's important. It's important for me personally. It's important for the industry and for all of our listeners to hear your thoughts. Now, while COVID-19 and the BLM movement have been front and center in the public consciousness, there's some other, fairly important stories that are out there bubbling. Living in the Baltimore-Washington area and having the misfortune of being a Ravens fan throughout, how long have they been in the league? 3, 5 years?
Now, just 20 some and a couple Super Bowls later.
How do you manage the politics of dealing with Redskin fans in basically one mega market that you're operating in?
Well, I sympathize with Redskins fans. I appreciate much like Steelers fans have past delusions of glory, rightly so, in what their past performance has been, right? And every year they go into a season thinking that this will be that year, right? Yet, many cases it becomes an effort in futility. So while I am not completely agnostic to the Redskins fans, I am certainly appreciative of them circling the airport of success and not being able to land the plane for the last 20 years.
I'm sure it's a delicate line you have to walk there on occasion.
Absolutely.
Now, with Ben Roethlisberger healthy and the Steelers' defense ascendant, I think, wouldn't you agree they're the odds-on favorite to win the AFC North and, convert that for their 7th Lombardi trophy this year?
I would agree with that if I were delusional, sure. But if they're going to win the Battle of Cleveland, you get my support. They could win that battle. I'm absolutely sure that they could be the champs of Ohio. Wow.
You realize 4 of our players or personnel are being inducted into the Hall of Fame this year, right? I think is that 4 more than the Ravens have? I'm not. No, they at least have 1, but I think he was a Steeler, Rod Woodson.
We got a couple. We got a couple. But listen, you said earlier that you're a kid of the '80s, and I think Janet Jackson had a song back then that went along the lines of "What have you done for me lately?" So I just want you to think about that, Matt, in terms of your perspective on your team, and I appreciate your loyalty to your cause.
I appreciate it. I'll leave it at this, and this is for the benefit of all of the AFC North. We have possibly the greatest combination of quarterbacks leading each of our teams that the NFL has ever seen as we move into 2020. So I am looking forward to some very serious competition this season. Pray for there is one.
Hey, I hope there is a season, and I don't know what Roethlisberger is like 47 now, so he might have a good year or game left in him, maybe. I don't know, but I appreciate the opportunity to compete.
Come on, Tom Brady's got to be 65 now. Big Ben's like a young millennial compared to him. All right, so thank you, and thank you for your time today. Lastly, with all of our guests, we like them to answer a few questions that our listeners learn some things about them that you can't find on LinkedIn, right? So for the first one, we ask every guest, what was your first car?
An 83 Olds Cutlass Sierra, tan in color. Had no heat or AC. And I thought I was the cat's meow because I wasn't catching the bus anymore.
That is a sweet ride right there.
Yeah.
Now, this is for everybody that's kind of going through this COVID-19 stay-at-home pandemic. What are you currently watching on Netflix, and what series would you recommend to our listeners?
Oh, boy. I watch Little Fires Everywhere. That was probably one of my surprise favorites of the pandemic, like watching Little Fires Everywhere. The Messiah was also pretty good. Right. I'm trying to think of obviously everybody watched The Last Dance, right? So watching The Last Dance was also pretty good. And I am attempting, although unsuccessfully at this moment, I am attempting to get into Ozark.
We are knee deep in the Ozarks right now. We are in season 3, and it is every episode is better than last. And I'm a big fan of Justin Bateman. So it's quite good.
So I will tell you, though, a couple of good reads in audiobook, though, that I found really good. The Gift of Struggle by Bobby Herrera. Nonviolent Communication, Marshall Rosenberg. And so I've been working a lot on some personal development and communication skills because I think the next level of leadership requires an empathetic, like your EQ and your IQ have to be equally high. So those are books that have been pretty impactful for me over the last couple of months in terms of just repositioning mindset around like the kinds of language I use, the importance of like getting to like this whole thing of you as a married man, you can appreciate identifying what your feeling is versus what your need is. And sometimes those aren't the same things being communicated, and the power of the word should. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff in the space of personal development that I've been working on the last 90 days or so.
Well, that sounds really interesting. I'm going to make note of those books too. That's fantastic. Thank you. Now, last question. If you could travel anywhere in the world, post-COVID on an all expenses paid vacation, where would you like to go, and what are some of the things you would do there?
Man, if I had to pick one destination, I'm going to go with a place that I haven't been, but I'd love to go to, and that would be Fiji. Because it's like obviously beautiful. There's water, there's sun, there's island, and they're likely not going to be, it's not going to be like Honolulu. So there'll be people there, but just enough people. Because I want to make sure I'm socially distanced and have an exotic experience that you just couldn't get anywhere else. So that probably would be where I want to go. If I had to pick a place that I've gone to before, the family went to Europe for the first time last August. I would go back. I really enjoyed France and England. I would go back, France, England. I would also add Italy, Spain. I speak a lot of German, although I've never been to Germany. I took German from 7th grade in middle school up through junior year in college. So I'd love to go to Bavaria and go to the Black Forest. That's I'm rambling on, but that's sort of my list. It's my list.
Well, KW is global, so you'll probably have some some contacts all throughout.
It's a write-off, buddy. If I make real estate related meetings a part of that journey, right?
Yeah, you might have to open up KW Fiji. I don't know.
There we go.
Well, hey, thanks again for being on the program. I'm a little surprised Pittsburgh wasn't on your list, but we'll edit that in, and I look forward to catching up with you. Hopefully, we'll have a football season to commiserate about.
Hey, Matt, I appreciate you bringing me onto your platform and the ability to have this conversation with you. I appreciate one of the things that also I'd like to highlight just for purposes of just letting you know a level of personal appreciation I have. You are one of the very few people in my Realogy days who has consistently maintained friendship and contact. And that means a lot to me, buddy, that you've done that. And there's never really, I think this may be the first ask in 12 years, right, to come join you on your podcast. So that says a lot about you as a person and much about your character and the value of relationships that you have. So I want to let you know that I am forever grateful for that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I look forward to catching up with you soon.
All right, man.